Nobody in Cleveland has said anything official. No press conference. No depth chart posted quietly on a random Tuesday. The public language coming out of that building is still doing exactly what it's engineered to do. Keeping every name alive, keeping the media from having anything concrete to work with, maintaining the careful performance of an open competition. And I'm going to tell you right now, it's over. Shedeur Sanders won the Cleveland Browns quarterback job. The announcement just hasn't been scheduled yet. I know how that sounds. I know some of you are already reaching for the "it's only May" argument. So let me walk you through exactly how I got there, because I'm not asking anyone to take this on faith alone. The first real skill you build when you spend serious time around this league, not watching it casually, actually covering it, is learning to completely stop listening to what coaches say on the record. I mean that literally. NFL head coaches are among the most disciplined information managers in all of professional sports. They are trained, almost systematically, to control every variable that exits their mouth during competition windows. The actual words they use are the most carefully curated element in the entire communication. What carries real signal is everything that surrounds those words. The energy behind a name, the details that flow naturally versus the ones that have to be pried out. The framing decisions that quietly accumulate into a message the sentences themselves refuse to directly deliver. That is where genuine information lives. And that is exactly where Todd Monken gave the entire situation away. He sat in front of the media and delivered precisely what any head coach is professionally required to produce during an officially open competition. Balanced, measured, evenly distributed across every quarterback on the roster. On the surface, it read like a man being scrupulously fair and saying nothing of real consequence. But I know what to listen for underneath that structure. And underneath it, he told you everything. Start with Dillon Gabriel, because this is where the signal was loudest. When coaches genuinely believe in a quarterback, not organizationally support because contractual architecture requires it, but actually believe, they get specific without being prompted. They remember a throw from last Thursday's walkthrough. They bring up the moment in the film room where the young quarterback identified a coverage rotation that a veteran sitting 2 chairs over completely missed. They tell you about a rep that made 2 coaches exchange a quiet look across the room because they both recognized something real happening right in front of them. That kind of specificity doesn't manufacture itself. It surfaces naturally when a coach is emotionally invested in a player's future inside that building. And you genuinely cannot fake its absence. With Gabriel, that specificity simply wasn't present. What filled the space instead was technically professional language, warm, respectful, the kind of measured acknowledgement that any human being's genuine effort deserves. But he was not spoken about the way coaches speak about quarterbacks with real organizational momentum behind them. The language had a particular texture, resolved at its center. And anyone who has spent serious time learning how NFL buildings actually communicate would recognize that register immediately. Gabriel isn't being moved because he embarrassed the organization. He's not leaving because the coaching staff lost faith in his work ethic or his character or his daily preparation. He's leaving because the building has internally moved past the question of whether he's the answer. And once that shift happens inside an NFL organization, the emotional investment quietly redirects itself. The specific reps stop surfacing naturally in conversation. The energy behind the name changes in subtle ways. The story stops getting told with genuine forward momentum. And when a head coach stops telling your story with real investment behind it, the trade conversations have already started in rooms that no cameras ever reach. Something else about Gabriel's exit deserves to be said beyond just his individual situation. His presence in that quarterback room was generating friction, not the productive kind, not the friction that sharpens everyone's preparation and pulls the standard higher for the whole competition. The other kind, the low-grade, daily accumulating tension that builds when 3 people are occupying a psychological space that can realistically only belong to one. Competing timelines, competing frustrations, competing internal narratives, all sharing the same room every single morning with no resolution coming. When that dynamic walks out the door, the room breathes differently. What's left is a cleaner structure. 1 job, 2 men, a genuine competition that can finally operate the way it was always supposed to. Now I need to talk about Deshawn Watson, because this is where Monken's language was simultaneously most deliberate and most revealing. Every sentence in that portion of his remarks felt considered before it left his mouth. He said everything he was professionally required to say. He acknowledged Watson's football intelligence. He recognized the value of a quarterback who has managed an NFL offense under genuine pressure, who has made decisions in moments where the margin was essentially nothing, who carries experiential knowledge that no film session can transfer to a young quarterback still building his internal library. Every bit of that acknowledgement was real. I'm not suggesting it wasn't. But threaded through every sentence, and I mean threaded deliberately, was a specific absence. Monin never once made a clear, forward-looking declaration that Watson is the durable foundation around whom a full season and a real playoff push can actually be constructed. He is too professional to say the blunt version publicly, and that isn't how NFL organizations communicate in these situations anyway. But the framing carried the message the actual words refused to deliver. Watson was never positioned as the cornerstone. He was positioned as a valued asset, respected, acknowledged with genuine care, whose organizational role had been quietly and permanently recalibrated from where it stood when he first arrived in Cleveland. The availability mathematics on Watson aren't complicated, and nobody in that building is pretending otherwise. 19 games over 5 seasons, not 19 difficult games, not 19 inconsistent games. 19 total appearances in a uniform that costs $33 million per year, fully guaranteed, for a staff trying to install a timing-dependent offensive system, one that requires real connective tissue between a quarterback and his receivers built across months of daily repetition. That number represents a structural problem that no amount of organizational optimism can engineer around. You cannot build the kind of quarterback-receiver chemistry that actually wins games in November around someone whose presence on the field you cannot reliably count on week to week. Monin ran that arithmetic, the front office ran it, and the managed, respectful framing surrounding Watson's name confirmed the calculation had been completed and permanently filed away. What Watson genuinely brings to Cleveland going forward is real, and I want to be direct about this because I'm not dismissing legitimate value. What I'm describing is where that value now lives within the organizational structure. He is an experienced backup, a sideline resource with capabilities most teams can only dream of accessing from that roster position. A quarterback who has been through the moments that break most people, who has carried an offense under real pressure in real games with real consequences, and who can sit beside Shedeur between series and offer something no film room session can replicate. Raw, lived, unscripted knowledge of what it actually feels like to manage an NFL offense when the safety net has been completely removed. If Watson has accepted that role, and the signals emerging from that facility suggest the right conversation happened and the right answer came back, then Cleveland has quietly constructed one of the more functional backup situations in the entire league. That is deliberate organizational construction. That is real value. So remove Gabriel from the picture, reposition Watson. What's standing at the top of that depth chart is the conclusion everyone paying honest attention has already reached: Shedeur Sanders. And the way he actually earned that position deserves to be told clearly, because the public narrative around this kid has been distorted and loud enough that the real story underneath keeps getting buried. He didn't get this job because the competition dissolved around him. He didn't land here by default, or because of his father's name, or because of a draft position that certain people seem to resent in ways I still find genuinely strange to observe. He won it the way quarterbacks consistently win jobs that aren't simply handed to them, by showing up every day, doing the work without requiring an audience for it, and handling every uncomfortable external circumstance with a composure that communicated something specific to that coaching staff. Something no practice throw, no matter how perfectly placed, could deliver on its own. The message essentially was this: when the season gets genuinely hard, and every NFL season gets hard in ways nobody fully anticipates, I am going to be the solution, not the next problem sitting in your lap. Coaches stop evaluating what quarterbacks say almost immediately. They have heard every version of the commitment declaration, every carefully constructed speech about process, preparation, and being ready for whatever comes. They have heard those exact words from players who then delivered completely, and from players who evaporated the instant real pressure arrived. What coaches actually measure is behavioral, specifically behavior under conditions that were never designed for anyone's comfort. And what Shedeur gave this coaching staff across the entire offseason was a sustained, consistent behavioral argument that his foundation was real, not borrowed from his father's reputation, not constructed from draft hype, built through how he carried himself when Gabriel was competing hard and Watson's heavyweight veteran presence was daily reminding the entire room what an established NFL quarterback looks and sounds like. Built through the composure he maintained when the Deshaun narrative, relentless and loud and never quite accurate, kept trying to pull him sideways. Built through every day when every excuse to be somewhere else mentally was sitting right there, available and convenient, and he simply chose not to pick any of them up. Monin received that argument. The press conference confirmed it had landed exactly where it needed to land. Now let me tell you what Cleveland has assembled around him, because the environment Shedeur is walking into is one of the more deliberately constructed, developmental situations for a young quarterback this league has put together in recent memory. The details matter here, and the details have largely been lost inside the broader noise. Start with Spencer Fono, selected 9th overall. Sit with that number for a moment beyond just the draft capital it represents. You do not spend a top 10 pick on an offensive tackle unless the quarterback receiving that protection is worth the organizational commitment that selection carries. The arithmetic only functions if the person you're protecting justifies the price attached to the decision. That pick was a declaration. Quiet in its delivery, completely unambiguous in its meaning. Phono brings natural balance, technically precise footwork at the point of attack, and the processing ability to handle complex pass rush games without getting exposed by interior stunts. What he gives Shedeur is something young quarterbacks almost never actually receive. Genuine, breathable time inside the pocket. Not get it out before contact time, not scramble or die time. The kind of protected time that allows a quarterback's eyes to work through a full progression, to find the second and third reads before pressure forces a compromised early decision, to build in-game confidence that compounds across a full season, rather than slowly draining away behind a protection unit that can't sustain its assignments. KC Conception adds a dimension that's entirely different in kind. A route runner built specifically to operate against tight man coverage, which is historically the coverage structure that most aggressively exposes young quarterbacks because it demands timing precision and the confidence to throw a receiver open before visible separation has fully developed. When a receiver consistently wins at the line of scrimmage against press, it fundamentally restructures how a defensive coordinator has to allocate resources across the field. Commit real attention to stopping it, and you open everything around it. Concede it and watch it methodically dismantle your game plan. There is no comfortable middle ground. A weapon like that doesn't just generate completions, it reorganizes how an entire defense thinks before the snap, and that reorganization creates operating space for everything else in the offense. The complete picture is a young quarterback being placed inside a system specifically built to support his development rather than demand immediate perfection from it. Protected up front at the level only top 10 draft capital can purchase. Armed with weapons that win in genuinely different ways against different coverage structures. Coached by a head coach with real offensive background who has already committed to Shedeur's growth in ways that extend well beyond anything said publicly. Backed by a defense constructed to keep the team competitive on the days when the offense is still working through the natural inconsistency every young quarterback navigates in his first full starting season. None of that is accidental. It is the product of an organization that made a decision about its quarterback and then deliberately aligned everything else in the building with that internal decision. When a franchise constructs its entire offseason infrastructure around a specific player without publicly declaring him the starter, that is the clearest possible signal that the internal declaration was made a long time ago. Now, the honest version of where this actually goes, because I'm not in the business of dressing comfortable predictions up as analysis. Nothing in this league is guaranteed. Not for Cleveland, not for any roster that looks coherent and purposeful in May. Injuries happen without warning and derail things that looked inevitable hours before they materialized. A brutal October stretch can fracture a team's collective confidence in ways that cannot be forecasted from the spring. A young quarterback's first genuinely adverse moment, the first real stretch where nothing is working, the environment gets heavy, the outside noise gets loud, and the internal doubts start knocking harder than expected. That moment arrives for everyone eventually, and nobody can tell you in advance how it resolves itself. The league's unpredictability isn't a disclaimer you attach to protect yourself from being wrong later. It is a fundamental feature of the competition itself. What I can tell you with genuine confidence is this: the architecture in Cleveland is more coherent right now than it has been in a very long time. The quarterback situation, which has been the defining source of organizational chaos for this franchise for longer than any honest observer wants to count out loud, is quietly resolving itself around a player the coaching staff has already internally chosen. The offensive infrastructure surrounding him is intentional, specific, and built to actually develop a quarterback, rather than simply survive a season behind one. The room around him has been deliberately constructed to accelerate real growth. The head coach running this operation is a man who calls things embarrassing when they're embarrassing, who has no professional interest in maintaining comfortable temperature at the expense of honest standards. In a franchise that has let too much go unaddressed for too long inside that building, that might be exactly the internal climate this organization has needed for years. The rest of the league hasn't fully processed what's being assembled in Cleveland. That's fine. They'll figure it out soon enough.